Samsung has just announced the S25 Edge. I've had hands-on with it last week and I've got lots of killer thoughts. I've just got a few things to talk about. Aren't smartphones interesting? Yeah, we've gone from having devices that were as big as the iPhone 13 mini or as small as the iPhone 13 mini to things like this, which are huge, and then even things that do this and flip upwards and do all that sort of stuff. And then we've kind of come back to simplicity with phones like the iPhone 16e. Now we have this kind of dawning era of thin phones, and the first one to get involved is Samsung, predictably, because they do this. They get in there first. They did that with foldables and all that sort of stuff. They beat Apple to the post, basically. That's the most important thing here. And they've done that again with the S25 Edge. Now, this isn't a review of that phone. Well, it's kind of a review of a review because I have had hands-on with it, but only for about an hour, which is why this is very much a first impressions. But if you're thinking about buying it and if you're fascinated by this kind of thin phone thing that's happening, this is the video to watch. I will have a full review coming fairly soon, so make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever it is and the bell not to miss that one. But, well, let's get into it because I'm fascinated by this thing and I have some hopes for it and some concerns. Let's assume that you haven't watched the S25 Edge launch and that you've just waited for this video to find out the highlights. These are the specs that I think you need to know about. It's 5.8 millimeters thin or thick, whichever way you want to swing it, and 163 grams. By comparison, the regular S25 is 7.2 millimeters thin and weighs 162 grams. So it's a gram heavier than the regular S25, and it's, in fairness, it's a lot thinner. It's a lot thinner than the iPhone 16, which is 7.8 millimeters, and that weighs 170 grams. So it definitely beats the iPhone in that respect. It's got a titanium frame, which is interesting because that does immediately put it into the kind of flagship category. 3 colors: silver, jet black, and icy blue. A 6.7-inch Quad HD Plus display with 2,600 nits and a variable 120 Hz refresh rate display. Snapdragon 8 Elite chip. Again, that puts it into the flagship territory. I didn't get the RAM. I don't think they told us the RAM during the press briefing. It's got a 3,900 milliamp hour battery, which promises 24 hours of video playback. It's got 25 watt wired charging and 15 watt wireless charging. The camera system is basically, it's got the same 200 megapixel regular camera as the rest of the S25 lineup, but unlike the standard S25, it has a better ultra wide. So it has an ultra wide with a macro capabilities and autofocus, which is nice, so that's a bit of an upgrade. 12 megapixel selfie. It shoots up to 8K video, bonkersly, is that a word? 8K video at 30 frames per second. IP68, it's got Corning Gorilla Glass Ceramic 2 on the front and Victus 2 on the back. 7 years of OS and security updates. The price, are you ready for this? For the 256 gig version, it costs £1,099 in the UK, and for the 512 gig version, $1,199. So it kind of sits somewhere between the S25 Plus and the S25 Ultra. It's kind of in that middle bit there. However, as you would guess with Samsung, there are going to be some launch offers. So basically you can get double storage until the end of the month. And they're launching something called Galaxy Club, which is this kind of club, obviously, where you pay a fee and then you can upgrade yearly. You get a guaranteed trade-in value for your phone. You get Samsung Care Plus, 0% finance. Quite interesting. I won't go into that in this video, but it's worth going to have a look at if you're a proper Galaxy fan person. But that's it in terms of the specs and the pricing, and that does give it this kind of weird sort of status as a flagship phone. Yeah, is it a flagship? It is. It's a flagship phone, but it doesn't have some of the flagship specs. So it doesn't have the really big battery. It doesn't have the all-singing, all-dancing camera system. And that leaves a few questions. First impressions of the S25 Edge is that it's very thin, ridiculously thin, which I know sounds obvious because that's most of the point of this phone, but this isn't the first time I've seen it. So I did see it a couple of months ago at a trade show, but back then you couldn't touch it. It was behind a display. It was without, basically you couldn't put it into your hands. Whereas last week I did get it in my hands and kind of felt it and caressed it and got a feel for it. And immediately the first thing you think is, this is a feat of engineering. When you bear in mind the specs, it's got pretty much the same specs in terms of the internals as the S25 Ultra. You know, the same Snapdragon 8 Elite chip, which has been designed, well, it's been tweaked for Galaxy, so Samsung works with Qualcomm to make it their own, basically. It's got all of that stuff going on. It's got all of the AI stuff built into it. Okay, the camera system is slightly downgraded and the battery is smaller, but you have to make some concessions here. The display is roughly the same as the S25 Ultra, really, kind of. It doesn't have the anti-reflective coating, which that one does, but it's as near as makes no difference the same display. And it's in this really thin packaging, and that's the impressive thing about it. Just for a laugh, we did put it up against the iPhone 16e, and as you can see, the iPhone 16e is ridiculously thick against it. Okay, these aren't comparable phones because of the specs and the pricing differences, etc., but it's just, well, it gives you an idea of how thin this phone is. It basically feels like a thin S25, which is exactly what it is because it's part of that family. It's important to remember that. This isn't a standalone product, it's part of the S25 range, which does suggest it's going to be part of it going forward. So, I guess we'll get an S26 Edge next year and so on and so forth. The other thing I noticed was the colors, which we've got this thing with tech colors these days where they're a bit muted. The only tech product that I can think of from the big brands that is very funky and kind of eye-catching in terms of colors is the iMac. Apart from that, it's all these kind of muted shades of blue and grey and all that sort of stuff. And yes, it looks smart, it looks like a very fancy piece of kit, but I would have loved some funky colours. Maybe we'll get those at some stage, I don't know. The camera, I had this thing in my hands for an hour, guys, and we were basically getting footage of it. We didn't have time to properly test it in that respect, but the camera system appears to do a pretty good job. It's got the same regular camera as the rest of the S25 lineup, and personally, I love that camera system. Now, yes, the optical range, zoom range, is limited because there's no telephoto lens on there. We just get the regular and the ultra wide, but that ultra wide does have autofocus and it does have macro capabilities, which you don't get with the regular S25, so that's nice. It's got all of the AI stuff, like I mentioned earlier, so One UI 7, that comes as standard with the S25 Edge, and it has all of the fancy photo editing stuff and audio editing and all that business. It's got the Now Brief and all that as well, so it's got everything you expect from a Samsung phone. Yeah, first impressions is that it's just very, very thin. And I think what that's doing, it's ushering in, hopefully, this new era, which we had before. Basically, with smartphones, we had this era for a long time where a launch was all about the device. It was all about the new hardware, the camera system, the chip and the design, all that stuff. And then, a couple of years ago, it all became about AI. It was all AI this, AI that. And it's really hard to stay excited about that because it's just way too much. And the problem with that era that we're kind of still in at the moment is that the smartphone part of it, the hardware part of it, of these launches, is tiny. You get 90% AI and software and 10% here's the new device. The S25 Edge, I think, is slightly different. Obviously, it's going to have all the AI focus on it from Samsung's point of view because it's a big deal for them. And in fairness, they are streets ahead. They're up there with Google when it comes to consumer-facing AI stuff. But I think they're going to give us much more about the hardware. In fact, they're doing that already. The marketing for this, I think, is going to be very much more about the hardware. And as someone who loves hardware, someone who deeply loves these devices and loves talking about the way they do interesting things and the way they look and feel, the S25 Edge, I think, is taking us back to that era. But there's one very big question. Before I get to that big question, let me run through my hopes and concerns for the S25 Edge, starting with the concerns because this is the internet. Is it too thin? That's the obvious one. If you put it into your back pocket and sit on it, will it bend? I don't think it will, personally. Samsung will have tested this, obviously, and phone hardware these days is pretty robust. I know that jerry-rig everything will get it and go and possibly bend it, but maybe the S25 Edge will defeat jerry-rig everything. The second concern is the pricing. Is it too expensive? I don't think it is. I think Samsung has pitched this just right between the S25 Plus and the S25 Ultra, and you get their trade-in deals, which are pretty good normally, and if you order it before the end of the month, you get that double storage thing as well, and if Apple launches the iPhone 17 Air later this year, I think the Edge will be cheaper. I think the Apple version of the ultra-thin phone will be quite expensive, and it won't have the early bird deals and double storage and all that sort of stuff. And generally speaking, Apple's trade-in values are lower than Samsung's. The other concern is obviously the concessions, so the battery life, what's that going to be like in real life? I think Samsung's being very conservative with this. You know, they're saying 24 hours of video playback and all-day battery life. What does that mean? I don't know until I get it and start testing it. Remember to hit that subscribe button not to miss the full review, by the way. The other concession, which is the camera system. Okay, we get the lovely ultra-wide, we get the fantastic, I think, standard 200 megapixel camera, but we don't get serious, 5x, 10x optical zoom ranges that you do get with the S25 Ultra. Will that be an issue? Hopefully not. My hopes are the fact that this might usher in a new era of thin phones. So yes, Apple is rumored to be doing this later this year, but what about the rest of the Android manufacturers? I think they'll follow suit, and that means we'll get all sorts, hopefully, of really interesting thin phones, including possibly a smaller thin phone, not the iPhone, but there could be, who knows, an Android manufacturer who comes out with one which is as big as this, or as small as this, and as thin as the Edge. That would be nice. In fact, Samsung, just do that as well. Do it, please. But back to that big question. Who's going to buy the S25 Edge? That is the big question, and I'm turning it over to you guys. Let me know in the comments who you think this phone is for. I'm fascinated by these responses. Get involved, and remember, hit that subscribe button if you don't want to miss the full review.